Mexico City has a relationship with football that is difficult to explain to someone who has not lived it from the inside. It is one of the largest cities in the world, with more than 20 million people in its metropolitan area, and football is not simply a sport there. It is a conversation that never closes. It is the topic of the taxi ride, the market, the family gathering on Sunday, the office on Monday morning. It is the common language of a city that has too many differences to have many common languages. In that city, Santiago Giménez Barón was born on the 18th of April 2001. And he was born with something very few boys who dream of being footballers have, a father who had already been one. Marcelo Giménez, nicknamed El Chaco by his teammates, was a central defender who played in Mexico and Argentina for more than a decade. He was not a world-class star, not a player who filled stadiums or appeared on the covers of international magazines. He was a serious, dedicated professional who understood football with a depth that came from having lived it from the inside for years. And when his son Santiago took his first steps in the game, El Chaco was the first to understand that this boy had something different, that he was not simply the son of a footballer who wanted to follow his father's footsteps. He was a natural striker, with that instinct for goal that no academy manufactures, and that when it appears must be nurtured with the same care one gives to anything truly rare. Growing up as El Chaco's son in the Mexican football environment had its advantages and its disadvantages. The advantage was access, knowledge, an understanding of the professional football world that very few boys his age possessed. From childhood, Santiago was in dressing rooms, on training pitches, surrounded by professional players who talked about football with the naturalness of those who lived from it. He absorbed all of that. He stored it somewhere in his mind where things are kept that later, when the moment comes to use them, appear without one knowing quite where they came from. The disadvantage was comparison. When your surname is the same as your father's, and your father played professional football, the world watches you with a mixture of expectation and skepticism that can be exhausting. The expectation that you must live up to the name. The skepticism of those who think you are the product of contacts and influence rather than pure talent. Santiago Giménez had to deal with that from very young. And the way he did it was the simplest and the hardest at the same time, by playing so well that the comparisons stopped mattering. He entered the youth divisions of Cruz Azul, one of the historic clubs of Mexican football. Cruz Azul, with its stadium in Mexico City, with its history of titles and also of painful disappointments that its supporters carry with a mixture of humor and resignation that only those who have waited a long time can develop, was the place where Santiago was going to form himself as a professional footballer. And at Cruz Azul, he learned what Mexican football means: the intensity, the physical contact, the demands of the short tournaments where a bad result can destroy an entire campaign, the pressure of supporters who, in Mexico, are immediate and passionate, and who do not wait long before delivering their verdict. He made his professional debut with Cruz Azul in 2020. He was 19 years old. And from his first matches in Liga MX, it was clear that this boy was not going to need much time to show that the Giménez name was going to have a new meaning from him onward. He scored. He scored with the frequency of strikers who were born for it, who do not need 1,000 chances, but who with 3 or 4 per match do what others cannot do with 10. He had that ability to be in the right place, at the right moment, that looks simple from the stands, and that in reality is one of the hardest attributes to develop in modern football, because it cannot be directly trained but only intuited. But Mexico became too small too quickly. Not because Liga MX is not a demanding championship, because it is, with well-organized teams and a physical intensity that surprises Europeans discovering it for the first time. It became too small because Santiago Giménez had the ambition of those who know their ceiling is higher than what they can reach where they are. And in 2022, at 21 years old, he made the decision that was going to change his career and his life, crossing the Atlantic to try his luck in European football. Feyenoord of Rotterdam was the club that bet on him. Feyenoord is one of the great Dutch clubs with a rich history and a fan base that ranks among the most passionate in Europe. The De Kip Stadium, the Cube of Rotterdam as its supporters call it, is one of those grounds where the atmosphere can be so intense that it is felt in the chest from the moment you enter. It is not a glamorous destination in the way Real Madrid or Bayern Munich are, but it is a real club with a real level of demand where young players who arrive with ambition have the opportunity to prove themselves to themselves before anyone else. And Santiago Giménez proved an enormous amount to himself. The first season was one of adjustment. Dutch football, the Eredivisie, has particular characteristics. It is a more open football than the Spanish or Italian, with more space, with a rhythm that favours strikers who know how to run in depth and who have a good first touch. Santiago took a few months to find the rhythm, to understand exactly what that system asked of him and what he could offer within it. And when he found it, there was no stopping him. The goals began to arrive. First gradually, then in a torrent. Headers using his jump and his ability to win aerial duels. Left-footed and right-footed goals from inside the area, with that striker's coolness that, when alone against the goalkeeper, does not think about the stadium or the nerves, but only about the angle and the exact power the shot needs. Goals in the Champions League, which was the true showcase that introduced him to the rest of Europe. In the Champions League group stage, Feyenoord faced Atletico de Madrid, Lazio, the great names of the continent. And in those matches, against those opponents, Santiago Giménez scored with a regularity that began to make the scouts of the major European clubs open their notebooks with an interest that was no longer mere curiosity, but urgency. The brace against Bayern Munich was the moment that changed everything. Bayern, the biggest club in Germany and one of the biggest in the world, visited Rotterdam on a European night, and Santiago Giménez scored twice against them. Against Bayern Munich, at 22 years old. With that naturalness that strikers have, who are not intimidated by crests or reputations, but who simply do what they know how to do, regardless of who is on the other side. After that night, the name Santiago Giménez echoed through the offices of the most important clubs in Europe with an insistence that had no going back. AC Milan in Italy was the one that moved most decisively. Milan, one of the most historic and most glorious clubs in world football, with its San Siro stadium that is one of the temples of the sport, decided that Santiago Giménez was the striker they needed to compete again for the titles the club had dominated in the past. They paid a significant fee and took him to Milan, to Serie A, to another level of demand and visibility. In Serie A, carrying the weight of Milan's history and the demands of a city that experiences football with particular intensity, Giménez kept being what he had always been, a goal scorer. Because that is the defining characteristic of great strikers, that they do not depend on the context or the system or the manager to do what they do best. They score at Feyenoord and they score at Milan. They score in the Eredivisie and they score in Serie A. They score when the team plays well and they score when the team plays poorly. That consistency, that independence of individual performance from external circumstances, is the hardest thing to find in football and is exactly what Santiago Giménez has. In the Mexican national team, Santi arrived to fill a void that had been evident for years. Mexico had had great generations of players, with Chicharito Hernández as the great reference of the recent past, with Hugo Sanchez as the absolute legend of Mexican football. But between one generation and the next, there is always a transition period where the team looks for someone to fill that central role, that number 9 who, when he receives the ball facing goal, makes the opposing defense nervous. Santiago Giménez is that player for this generation. And now, the biggest moment arrives. The 2026 World Cup, at home. Mexico is one of the co-host countries alongside the United States and Canada, which means the Mexican national team not only has to compete in the tournament, but does so in front of its own people, in its own stadiums, with the Estadio Azteca as backdrop. That colossus of nearly 100,000 people that has been the stage for some of the most important pages in the history of world football. The Azteca, the stadium where Pelé lost and where Maradona won, where the final of 2 World Cups was played, where Mexico has lived its greatest nights and some of its deepest frustrations. Playing there, wearing the number 9 of the Mexican national team, with the entire country watching, with the history of Mexican football as context, is a responsibility that very few footballers in the world could carry without being crushed by the weight. Santiago Giménez can. He can, because he grew up with that pressure from the time he learned to walk. Because the Giménez name in Mexican football already carries the pressure of a previous generation. Because he passed through the Netherlands and Italy and learned to score goals in the most diverse circumstances and in the most demanding stadiums. Because he is 25 years old and at the fullest moment of his career, with the experience of the great European stages and the energy of someone who knows the best chapter of his story has not yet been written. Mexico has spent decades reaching the round of 16 at World Cups and falling there. The famous fifth match, that ghost that Mexican supporters carry with a mixture of dark humour and genuine pain, is the barrier this generation wants to break. And to break it, goals are needed. Someone is needed who, when the match is tight, and the score is level, and the stadium is silent, has the cold blood and the talent to find the goal that changes everything. That someone carries his father's surname, but the story is entirely his own.